So first question comes from Mark. I took a soil food web class from Dr. Elaine Ingram. She recommended a book called Teeming with Microbes. Are you familiar with this book, and would you recommend it?
I would. I know Jeff Lowenfels well. I hadn't seen him in too long, actually, but I know that he's a very reputable writer. I have a lot of respect for him, and I have a lot of respect for Dr. Ingham as well. I think with anyone that wades into the Compost Tea conversation, one of the things you find is kind of what you may have felt for me in this presentation. Is like I can present what I know, but what does it really mean to know what I know when I can't know it all, right? So my approach is a little bit simpler. Maybe that's the wrong word, but it's the one that comes to mind. A lot of what Ingham and Dr. Ingham and Jeff do in his book, which is and I'll just definitively say it is an absolutely great primer for the soil food web. Do get the book. I'm not picking on it. I'm just giving you some fodder of what I've come to, having moved through that book many years ago and into different realms, is that you can get really caught up into what food sources grow certain microbes and what bacteria to fungal ratio you need for certain applications and certain soil types. And I think that there's probably some relevance there. And it's really fascinating too, I should say. But what happens is people get really overwhelmed. The question becomes, how do you identify when the right timing of the, because when you start a brew, it's more bacterial dominant. It moves to fungal dominance, then protozoa dominance, then nematode dominance. So within that movement, you can articulate intellectually and say, well, if I brew a 12-hour tea, it's going to have more bacteria in it. If I brew the 24-hour tea, there's going to be more fungi. I normally never recommend more than 48 hours, but at 48 hours, you've got some nematode dominance. Not necessarily a bad thing. And you can get really caught up into like the timing of that. And it's really difficult to isolate a variable that can show you that that's worth your energy. And I don't want to say that it's not, but what I choose to approach is, rather than get into the guts of what microbe is what ratio, what food source, because we found that equisetum is grown by horsetail plant. We found the protozoa is grown by micronized feed hay. Sugars grow more bacteria, fish, kelp grow more fungi. All of that, again, is really cool. And make your recipes accordingly and experiment. I don't want to ever discourage that. But I think the simplest way into it for me, for someone who's not experienced in it, is just to say, look, brew it for 12 to 36 hours. I say 12 to 24. As long as the inoculant has a total food web in it, and you're applying a total food web to your scenario, the good thing about microbes is they figure it out, right? We don't need to direct them around. They know exactly what to do. Our job is just to make sure, as the contractor, to continue the construction worker analogy, that we're bringing the workers as often as we can to the job site and as concentrated as possible. So long-winded answer, but yeah, I think a lot of Jeff, and that book is fantastic.
Yeah, and let's see, Jeff also wrote, so that book was Teeming with Microbes. The link's in the chat. The Organic Gardener's Guide to the Soil Food Web. And Jeff Lowenfels also wrote Teeming with Fungi, The Organic Grower's Guide to Mycorrhiza, and
Teeming with Nutrients.
Yeah, Teeming with Nutrients, The Organic Grower's Guide to Optimizing Plant Nutrition.
I just bought that one, hadn't read it yet, but I suspect it'll be just as valuable. One of his abilities is really creating accessible language around something that can be very technically complicated. And he puts a lot of effort into that. And if you ever have a chance to see him speak, he's a riot, that guy. So do it. But he's done a lot for this conversation, and I have a whole lot of respect for them, for sure.
All right. I've got a question for you. With compost tea, there's no worry of any kind of health stuff with that. Like if I am using on tomatoes, I take the tomato in. If I'm just using that, I could just eat the tomato. I wouldn't need to wash it or anything like that? Or would you say definitely wash it?
That's a really good question. I think, the answer to that needs to be wash it. I've had experiences with people through the phone that drank compost tea. One of them got violently ill, and he was kind of the guy that like, oh, you got a hot pepper? I can eat anything, And I don't want to say it's funny because it was kind of dangerous, and I didn't recommend that he do it, but he did it, and he got really sick. I've also had people do that and it not harm them, but I'm not endorsing that whatsoever. So, at a concentrate, I think that's a different story than what you're saying. The question can sometimes be asked, there's a lot, and I'm not really connecting it to your question necessarily, but in my experience, there's a lot of people that connect to the headline of E. coli creating disease. I mean, we see it all over the news and in the headlines when it happens, when 50 people get sick for some organic farm that was selling lettuce or tomatoes that had E. coli on it. And a lot of them are organic. And it gives the concept a really bad name. And on some level, I understand that, it's just part of the way things work. But the reality is that, to connect a good organic practice with aerobic organisms that occur in soil, I mean, just go read all of the articles out there about how we don't eat soil anymore, and we should, and how disease is up in children because we, put hand sanitizer all over them and keep them inside in a bubble. So, I think the relevance of that is kind of a 50-50. There's no doubt that there is some value. I'm not, again, suggesting you ask, should I go eat it? But the idea that we clean our food, I think, is undeniably part of the sanitization of what has limited our bodies to be strengthened by the things that it can protect itself from. So it's kind of moving in and out of that. I would just say out of the utmost of caution to watch it, but I don't think there's anything innately dangerous about it directly.
Yeah, when those like those scares come out, I just think that like broccoli and spinach are cheap for a while.
Yeah. Yeah, right. You can move a market with a headline pretty good. So, take that and run with it for sure.
Next question's from Jeff. Jeff asks, kind of unrelated, but I've heard that essentially fermenting comfrey leaves in water and then applying that water to soil has benefits. Is there any truth to that, or have I simply poured really smelly water on my plants?
No, there is some truth to that. The comfrey plant is amazingly medicinal and diverse minerally. So as I referenced in what I was saying, the benefit of your smelly solution that you've created there, you've created an anaerobic brew. You're using anaerobic microbes that manifest in solutions or scenarios that don't have access to oxygen. And the reason it smells is because they're using a different metabolic pathway to extract and break down that material. It's kind of like why the marsh stinks at low tide, right? Because it's oversaturated, and the aerobic decomposition cannot occur. So what predominates is anaerobic decomposition. That's what you're doing with that comfrey. Absolutely do that, man. It's a great practice to undertake. You'll get a lot of value out of it, but make the connection that it's not a replacement for actively aerated compost tea and growing soil microbes. Soil microbes are typically not anaerobic microbes. Now, are there microbes that live in healthy soil that can operate anaerobically? Yes, that term is called facultative, and you can look it up. It's basically the ability of the organism can be either anaerobic if those conditions are predominated, or aerobic if those conditions are expressed. So in a sense, thank goodness that exists, because what happens when you violently change an ecosystem in a moment? If everything died in that posture, how would it start over? So there's an unbelievable resiliency in regards to microbes, not unlike what the spider mite comment that I made that I didn't extrapolate on. They're sharing genes. There's all kinds of complex things that are happening, and it's orders of magnitude more in the food web, soil food web. So I say all that to say that absolutely use a comfrey tea process. It's a great complement to compost tea, aerated compost tea. It's not going to replace it, and it's not really going to contribute soil microbes to your environment. What the anaerobic process is good at is extracting nutrition from the comfrey leaves for free, just steeping them in the water, and then it liquefies the ability for you to take it to the field. It's not unlike a passive process of processing kelp. If kelp meal is seaweed, dried seaweed, right? And then they grind it up and put it in a box and sell it for, whatever they sell it for £5, like $10 for £5, something like that. So you might find a quart of liquid kelp that's soluble for like $15 to $30. And the difference is it's the source material is the same. Liquid kelp is the value of kelp is inside the cell of the seaweed. So the process and value of the liquid kelp becomes how it's processed. How do you break the cell wall, either chemically or physically, and how dilute and how many kelp solids are in the product. The point that I'm driving at is that the comfrey leaves, you could go spread comfrey leaves all around your landscape. Now what if the soil was dead? Is it going to break down efficiently? I mean, I digress. But the point is the time at which you can achieve the value in doing it passively in that way is increased exponentially by extracting it through your anaerobic process. That's really the value of the process that you're undertaking. You're making the comfrey soluble towards its benefit rather than waiting for nature to do it for you. So keep doing that. Just don't assume that it's a replacement for, or inoculating soil microbes to your environment.
All right. We got a couple of Jeffs here, so I'm going to give the full name since he put it in. Let's see. Jeff Doles asks, sorry if I missed this, but can this be done with simple humus pulled from the forest earth or forest floor? I'm still horrible at composting, but I have access to forests.
Yeah, man. The forest floor is one of the most bioactive places on Earth, and it's unadulterated by humanity, and that's one of the reasons why it's so dynamic. We get in the way of all of this collectively on scale, right? That's what 98, 99% of farms are conventional, meaning they're actively killing the soil to grow the plant. They're basically operating big hydroponic systems, in the earth. So, yes, you can access forest floor humus, and that's a great source of starting to work with these soil microbes. What you'll find in the forest floor is it's highly fungal dominant, which is a good thing in the end. And fungi, you could probably sit here for an hour and talk about that alone in compost tea, because it's one of the hardest things to cultivate in a tea, because the fungi value is really in its hyphae and its maturity and its development and its ability to be undisturbed, and that's why we no-till, frankly. The reason for that is to let these food webs develop and mature, and to be honest with you, it can take years until it's reached its epitome. So that idea of fungi in tea is tough. You're going to get a lot of the source organisms from that forest floor, and then one of the strategies people undertake when they're using tea locally is they'll get a kiddie pool and they'll fill it full of oats and unrefined fungal foods, and they'll inoculate it with a good forest floor source, or any tea for that matter that has a full food web, and then spray it down with some fish and some kelp, and you really concentrate and allow it to sit there for 7 to 10 days. And after that period, you can see the fungi growing, right? And you basically replicated the forest floor in a kiddie pool. So if you don't live near the forest, you can cultivate the fungi proactively by creating that pit stop there in the kiddie pool and growing it out. Then you take that material and brew a tea out of it. It's pretty incredible. So all of that comes out, and it's not really an exact process, but the point is you're taking attention towards these microbes and growing them in ways that allow you to make more leverage out of it. So a bit of an aside, but yeah, to your question, you can absolutely source the forest floor, and I would say the prairie too. It's not going to be quite as concentrated, but any kind of unadulterated natural environment, go take a cup here, cup there, and, bring as much diversity together with some worm castings and, like I said, your buddy's compost, and jam on it. The more diversity, the better, and the food web organizes itself. So you don't have to feel like you're taking from the wrong place and doing the right thing. Just bring it all together, let it do its thing, and get the hell out of the way if you can, and that's absolutely something that you can do for sure.
And does it benefit compost tea so you've got your compost tea that you made from your compost, does it benefit to add more nitrogen? Like if I was going to add some fish emulsion to it before spraying it, or would I want that compost first?
Yeah. Well, would it be beneficial to add the fish to the tea or to the compost?
Well, I'm asking if it would be more beneficial to add it after composting or before.
I would say after, primarily because you're going to get more bang for your buck. Adding a bunch of fish emulsion, like now, if you have fish waste or fish, to our conversation last week, fish carcasses, things like that, put that in the compost all day, man. It's going to value add your compost. But if it was me and I bought a quart of fish emulsion, I don't really see any true value of spraying that down into the pile. Unless your angle is to grow out some fungi in a short cycle to concentrate that for delivery, for example. But what I would do is use the fish through the brewing process, because the fish, as it's presented, is is some kind of either a hydrolysate or a different posture of how they process fish. And it's soluble, which is why it can be used on its own, but it's unrefined. And what I mean by that is, like, molasses is an easy way to make that point. Molasses is a byproduct in some respects. But it's unrefined. So compare molasses and the complexity and the potential of decomposition there to, like, Dixie sugar, which is completely refined, or like honey that's, completely refined. You're not going to get honey is actually antimicrobial. So, and that's why they found samples in King Tut's tomb that are, still intact, because, microbes or salts are that way too, which is why people rub salts on their meat to preserve them. So the point being is, in the end, you would get more bang for your buck if you bought fish emulsion to use it through your tea. And think of it like this: the microbes are making that fish emulsion you purchased more available to the plant, and they're growing from it, right? And the process of manufacturing the enzyme, presenting it to the unrefined nature of the fish, turning that, which is what the enzyme did, if you remember that diagram, into something that is different than what it started at. That process is what microbes do. They break things down all the way to the smallest so that they can be built back up. So anytime you have an organic material, organic fertilization is about feeding microbes, period. Now, there's postures of organic products that feed the plant directly too. Like manure. You can feed a plant directly with manure from the solubility of the urea and the solubility of the manure. But after that process has been consumed and what's soluble is gone, the manure itself can't just melt into the potential that it can be. And you're not getting as much value out of the product. So to that point, I wouldn't buy fish emulsion to put it on compost.
Okay. So if I am buying fish emulsion, mixing it with my compost tea right before spraying it, essentially I'm giving the compost tea and the microbes in it more food, or a way to live longer.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting thought. Yes. To answer your question, I would add the fish before I started the tea, to the brew, to the recipe. And somewhat you can kind of digress from that. If you've got a fish that has been completely processed, and I'd have to see the product, because fish emulsion is not just fish emulsion. Hydrolysate is not the same as emulsion, and there's different grades. And so without getting too complex about it, the bottom line is any unrefined organic matter that can flow through your sprayer, which a fish emulsion should have been screened to be able to do, is valuable to add to your brew. And one of the things that it's easy for me to kind of build on, what I'm used to talking about with our compost tea recipe, we positioned it to be very forgiving and not stage specific for the plant. In other words, it's going to have below 1 on an NPK. It's about 400 parts per million in water. You can't burn a plant with it. And we did that intentionally so that people could add it at concentrate at very high volumes to add more microbes at a time. Because if it had fish and bat guano and higher NPK fertilizers involved in the recipe, after you brewed it, you'd have to dilute it to not burn your plant. And then you're limiting the aggressive posture you can take with the microbes. So having said that, with our recipe, one of the things that people do is, say they've got a short cycle grow on an indoor garden and they're growing, a flowering plant, and they want a grow fertilizer and then a bloom fertilizer, and they're brewing teas. Well, if they're brewing our recipe, they're not going to get a nitrogen emphasis in the grow and then a phosphorus potassium emphasis in the bloom. So what they do is just add on to our recipe with like fish in the grow, right? And then in the bloom, they'll bring in a higher phosphorus, like Indonesian bat guano or something like that. And it's got a high P number, right? Which is going to encourage the flowering of the plant. So you can get into kind of building your recipes based on the mineral expression of for the crop. And that's more important because, minerals and elements don't self-organize. If you feed a plant in the flowering stage a ratioed higher amount of nitrogen than phosphorus, you're going to stunt that plant's ability to produce fruit. And we can move the plant with fertilizer in a way that plants don't want to move. You really can't do that with microbes. If you add too much fungi, if you have a fungi ratio that's higher than bacteria and you're working in an annual environment that would want a bacterial dominant soil, it's not going to harm a thing to add more fungi than you should, right? Because the fungi that's not needed is just going to get eaten by something else, So the self-organization of the living organisms, that's a good segue into what I was trying to say earlier, is it's not really about the point of delivery and the microbe strip spectrum. As long as it's a complete food web, it'll figure itself out. But what you can screw up is using the wrong mineral posture in the wrong stage of growth. And that can be applied through tea in a good and a bad way.
Yeah. And like you said, the key there is the complete food web.
Exactly.
Yeah.
As long as you're consistently bringing the whole team, they're going to figure out the work that needs to be done, and that's the cool thing about it. You really don't have to overthink it.
All right. Let's see. Jeff Bart asks, is there a preferred time of day to apply compost tea?
Not really from a biological standpoint. The same mantra you probably heard from applying liquids at any point, not at the peak of the day. I to be totally honest with you, I've never run into that being a real issue. If I'm in the middle of the day, and I got to do it because I got to go somewhere. I'm going to go do it. So I've never really had issues with that. But, you know, by the book, typically you'd want to do it, you know, before 10, you know, after 3 sometime.
Same with watering.
Yeah, exact same posture. There's nothing different there. Now, you can speak to the fact that the microbes, you know, need to orient themselves into the environment when they're applied. And if there's a high level of ultraviolet light, you can mitigate some of those bacteria and microbes by exposing them to that in the peak of the day. That is a true statement. Now, the problem is, how do you document that, right? It's a better story than there is proof available. But I don't want to say that it's not true. You know, so I would just stick to the normal sequences of watering, and you can water in the middle of the night if you want to. And a lot of times people ask, you know, seasonally, does it make sense to apply compost tea in the winter? Well, around us, you won't get snow. We got snow once in the last 5 years. I'm in Wilmington, North Carolina. And I know that because my kid's 5 and he's only seen snow once here, once. But the point is, you know, my statement is the soil slows down based on temperature, but it doesn't stop, right? So what I normally tell people is if you've never applied compost tea to your landscape and you find it in November or December and the soil is exposed and there's no snow on the ground and it's not frozen solid, you know, there's a high level of value of getting that process in the soil started as slow as it's going to go. If you're, you know, 2 years into applying teas and you've got a good thing going, there's no reason to continue doing it through the winter, you know? So it really comes down in my book as to whether you're getting started or whether it's been a consistency in your protocol. And, you know, hopefully that'll give you some window on how to do it. There's really not a right and wrong in the end. You know, microbes are, anytime you've got soil that's never been approached biologically, just do it yesterday, you know?
Yeah. And I think with the example of being in an environment where it snows, I mean, there's a reason why trees are deciduous. It's that they're going to drop their leaves. It's providing a protective layer, and I would assume there's a reason why. It's to keep that life under the ground alive. It's not to just randomly protect it for no reason.
Yeah, and that builds on the question that you asked last week. It got me thinking in a cool way. You know, is there any benefit to cover the soil for the microbes? And honestly, I'd never really addressed it in any kind of a direct way. But that, I think what you said there is relevant, and I'll add on to it. One of the things that we'll talk about in the energetic conversations that we'll have coming forward, which is going to be interesting. I'm always interested to kind of say things that people might not have heard before, and I'm excited to get this information to your group because it is, you know, not typical. But I've got a lot of experience in experiencing it, so I'd present it anyway, take it for what it's worth. That's kind of my style in that regard. But one of the things that's interesting is that when you factor in the idea that the earth breathes and all of the energy is in the earth, that one of the things that Steiner articulated is that warmth of the earth is inside of the earth in the winter, and it's expressed. It's not coming from outside always. That's kind of how we think, right? But that warmth goes into the earth. So that actually the soil in a lot of respects is more active in the winter than it is in the summer. Now we take that for granted because, you know, we can't conduct agriculture in the middle of the winter. But that is a very real thing. And you may know, is it Walapini, where you create underground greenhouses, you know?
Yeah, Walapinis.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, a friend of mine, Stuart Lundy, that I'd love to invite on the program at some point. He's a world-class biodynamic farmer. He's got a farm over in Accomack, Eastern Shore in Virginia. And him and I have a really tight relationship. He's more of like hands in the earth guy, and he uses me as a sounding board. And we have a good time trying to figure things out. And he has been experimenting with these kinds of things because you bury the preparation 500, the horn manure, in the winter. And it transforms in a very fundamental, visible way, frankly, and measurable way. And, you know, you'd like to think that if, you know, you can do this in upstate New York where the ground freezes, but yet the process still is undertaken. So, you know, it's an interest of mine to kind of drill into that. But the bottom line is it's worthy to think about, you know, that energy in the earth knows what it's doing. You know, it's not necessarily our responsibility. You know, people get all the time with worm farms. You know, they don't want any of the worms to die, you know. And it's really sweet, and it's, you know, it comes from a good place. They're like their little pets, right? But that's how it works. You know what I mean? The worm's getting eaten by the bird and it's life, right? So I kind of take the same approach with microbes. So am I really going to create an influence by worrying about the worms out in my soil? Not really. You know, they know exactly what to do and they're resilient. And the same's true with microbes in my experience.
Rob Avis did a course, a passive solar greenhouse design course, and that's all about building greenhouses in these climates, in the colder climates, temperate climates, and he goes into that quite a bit there in the course. It's pretty good.
Wow.
Yeah, and you think about, you're talking about the Earth breathing, and in the winter, it's warm, or it's breathing less,
It's breathing in, right?
it's breathing in, right, and
spring,
breathing out.
and you hit the summer equinox, and that's when the breath starts coming in, which we just hit a couple of weeks ago, right? So you got the inhaling happening now, right?
And I imagine that comes from all that biology in the soil going down when it gets cold, and that soil shrinking down a great deal and compacting. And then as it warms up, it releases, it breathes out, right?
It's an energetic and a physical thing. Just think about the compost steaming in a winter day, right? That's coming from the activity of the conditions that you've generated to take a high rate of biological activity. That's, for lack of a better word, friction.
Right.
That's where that heat's coming from. You don't have to do it in the sun. It should be steaming because it's alive, right? So, I think it's probably also fair to say the more mature and bioactive your soil is, the more influence you have of activity through the winter than otherwise. It's not like more are going to die. It's actually got a better incubator, if you will. Maybe that's the wrong word, but that's kind of a cool thing to think about.
All right. I know you don't like pushing your products, but you talked about them a little bit, so I think it'd be beneficial if you could share where people can go to get a hold of you or get their hands on this stuff.
I appreciate that. Go to microbemakers.com, MICROBE, microbemakers.com. And my email is evan@farmprogressive.com. I'm an open book. I'd love to work with you. I appreciate the opportunity, Josiah, and allow me to talk about what I do. I love what I do. I'm here to pay it forward in a lot of respects. I've been given a lot of help and a lot of directional pushed in the right directions by a lot of people that I value in my life. So hopefully I can, continue to meet people that can help me, push me in the right ways, and maybe I can push them a little bit too. Let's start pushing each other.
We're getting great feedback from people on the talks you've had with us. Yeah, I'm really excited for next week's episode. Once again, tv.permeethos.com. Check out the previous episodes, support the show, and we'll see you next week.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.